So in the previous lesson, we learned a little bit about studies on the origin of life, and one leading contender is that life emerged underneath the oceans at these volcanic vents. And in this little picture here, we've got a couple of very primitive types of cells emerging from their nurseries and going on to evolve into lots of different kinds of bacteria. So if we think about just sort of Darwin's lessons of variation plus selection plus heredity produces evolutionary change, and coupled with the fact that there are many different ways to make a living on Earth, then you're going to have a situation where the first kinds of bacteria evolved into many different kinds of early bacteria. So we'll have gene duplications and mutations generating all kinds of variation. Natural selection will be favoring those useful genes. And imagine this happening for a couple billion years, where bacteria were experimenting, in a sense, with biochemistry, which allowed them to live in many different environments and utilize different resources. So after 2 billion years of evolution, this is just, again, we're in the oceans. This is the only kinds of life on Earth are bacteria, but they have diversified greatly. In fact, one interesting invention by bacteria was photosynthesis. So photosynthesis, we are familiar, is the capacity to harness the energy of sunlight and use it to build sugar. And we see that in this reaction here. It's actually complex chemistry involving simple molecules like carbon dioxide and water as raw materials to build glucose with some waste oxygen. But this process was invented by bacteria. Now on our tree of life, then, the bacteria are represented low on the tree here. So Luca, the first living things, would have evolved quickly into lots of different kinds of bacteria. Now an important transformation happened, though. At around 2 billion years or so, a new kind of cell emerged. And these are complex cells. They are large, much larger than bacteria. They have a nucleus and they have mitochondria. So in this lesson, we'll take a look at this interesting transition between bacteria and the evolution of a more complicated type of cell. We're familiar with complex cells in the form of amoeba and paramecia. So here we have the amoeba is stalking, and it will capture this paramecium. So amoeba and paramecia are examples of single-celled organisms, but they are complex cells. So each has a nucleus, and they have mitochondria. And we can just see the size difference here in the little yellow circle here. That little bar there, that little rod, is a bacteria. So clearly a huge size difference. And it does raise a puzzle. How did these cells get so big? What allowed the complex cells to get so big? It seems as if bacteria have been around for a long time, but they have remained small. Perhaps there's some kind of limitation in size for bacteria. Well, then how did these kinds of cells get so big? And where did the mitochondria inside these complex cells, where did those mitochondria come from? In our cartoon cell, we see the two features of a complex cell. Here we have mitochondria, and here we have the nucleus. Now remember, the nucleus really is a nuclear membrane that surrounds DNA. All cells have DNA, including bacteria. It's the complex cells that have a nuclear membrane around the DNA. But let's focus on the mitochondria. So we've learned that mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cell. They complete the breakdown of glucose. So there's energy stored in those chemical bonds, and when you break those chemical bonds, energy is released, and that energy is captured in other molecules called ATP molecules, and they have smaller quantities of energy, more suitable for the chemistry of life. But it raises the question, does the cell make mitochondria? It could be that cells evolved the capacity to construct their own mitochondria. But as it turns out, there are some features of mitochondria that suggest another origin for mitochondria. And here they are. Mitochondria are the size of bacteria. Mitochondria have their own circular DNA like bacteria. And mitochondria reproduce like bacteria within cells. And this raises a really interesting possibility that mitochondria ancestors were free-living bacteria. In other words, the mitochondria found in cells today were once bacteria living on their own, and somehow they got themselves inside of a larger cell. Scientists suspect something like this. At some point in the history of cellular life on Earth, two bacteria type of cells merged to form one cell. We're going to call this the endosymbiosis theory. And it's really important because based on this idea here, Scientists think that complex cells arose just once in the long history of cellular life on Earth, and that event involved the merger of two separate species of bacteria, thus forming a larger, more complex cell. Specifically, scientists think that a larger bacteria cell incorporated a smaller bacteria cell and did not digest it. Now, we're going to call this endosymbiosis. The endo part refers to within, so the bacteria, now we call them mitochondria, the bacteria are inside of another cell, right? So the within part. And symbiosis, two species living in close association. So these were formerly two separate cells, now living together. So this arrangement was mutually beneficial. The smaller bacteria cell continued to produce ATP energy molecules for itself, but some leaked out to the larger cell. The larger cell, therefore, benefited from its new inhabitant. Right? So today we identify these as mitochondria. What are they good at? Producing energy. Well, then the big cell is going to get some of that energy. That would be one of the benefits of harboring this new cellular life form within the cytoplasm of the larger cell. In return, the smaller cell got a steady supply of nutrients and protection within the membrane boundary of the larger cell. So the small one here, it gets protection. After all, lots of other larger cells might have been eating it, right? So, if you can live inside the larger cell, then you're going to be protected. So as the smaller bacteria cell reproduced, the total energy production of the newcomers increased. The larger cell now had much more energy to support new evolutionary possibilities. And so this gets to the real significance of this merger event, because with this merger, it made possible the evolution of larger cells. So with the availability of more energy, cells could evolve larger size and greater complexity. So in the early history of life on Earth, when life is just single-celled, we want to think about this early phase of evolution where bacteria are experimenting with biochemistry, and then we get the endosymbiosis event, and now we have a new phase of evolution of life on Earth where complex cells are experimenting with size and complexity to live in different environments. But still, we are talking about single-celled organisms. However, both were very successful. On our tree of life, we see the endosymbiosis event would have occurred here. So we have two types of bacteria that would have merged to form the ancestor of the complex cell here. Notice all of these species on the rest of the tree, right, have complex cells or are just one complex cells. Right, so that rare symbiotic event produced the common ancestor of all organisms that are composed of complex cells. That is, everything except bacteria. If we take a closer look at that region, you can actually see there is a bacteria species here, and then a line goes to this region here in the word endosymbiosis here. Now, scientists think that the host cell was from the archaea domain. So the larger one was an archaea member, and then the smaller one that got inside was a type of bacteria. And so this free-living bacteria would have been the ancestor of mitochondria as those two cells merged. As it turns out, endosymbiosis also plays a role in the history of plants. Now, you recall here are plants over here, this the green branch on the tree of life. There was a second endosymbiosis event that was instrumental in the plant story. Now, you recall plant cells have two structures. They've got mitochondria, but they also have chloroplast, and it's in the chloroplast where photosynthesis takes place. So we have chlorophyll molecules capturing light energy, especially the blues and the reds, and that energy is going to be used to power the chemistry to build glucose from simple materials like water and carbon dioxide. Here's oxygen being liberated as a waste. Now, interestingly, when scientists were studying these chloroplasts, they, of course, were wondering, well, where did the chloroplasts come from? And again, the possibility is maybe cells are making their chloroplasts. But just like mitochondria, chloroplasts are the size of bacteria, and importantly, they have circular DNA like bacteria, and they reproduce as well. So we have the same set of clues that we found with mitochondria. That set of clues is also true of chloroplasts. So that suggests a second symbiosis event. One of these larger cells, now an active hunter because it has lots of energy, might have been eating up smaller cells, and as it incorporated a photosynthetic bacteria, it failed to digest. Here we see the cyanobacteria type of organism. There are still cyanobacteria today. This is a photosynthetic bacteria. It would have been eaten by the larger cell. Now, many other times, perhaps the food would have been digested, but for some reason, somehow it escaped digestion and took up residence in the cytoplasm of the larger cell. Notice this larger cell already had mitochondria, and that permitted its more active lifestyle. It had more energy to be the hunting type of cell. Again, there would have been a mutual advantage. The photosynthetic bacteria gets protection from the big cell, so it can avoid being eaten and gets a steady supply of nutrients, and the big cell gets some of the glucose made by the photosynthetic bacteria. So plant cells are host to two structures that used to be free-living bacteria. The mitochondria was a free-living bacteria, and the first endosymbiosis event was the origin of mitochondria. And then a second endosymbiosis event where the cell incorporated a photosynthetic bacteria. That cell became the ancestor of today's modern chloroplast. On our tree, then, again, the first really important endosymbiosis event happened down here, the origin of mitochondria, and that permitted cells to grow larger in size. And again, all subsequent life forms are composed of complex cells. And then a second endosymbiosis event gave rise to the chloroplast, which we find in today's modern plant cells. Now, endosymbiosis forces us to revise the concept of an evolutionary tree. You see, the typical tree that Darwin might think about, trees have branches that diverge from the trunk. But endosymbiosis means that cells or species converge to form a new kind of organism. We have the merging of two separate species. So far, then, we've talked about the evolution of complex cells, but again, we're still single-celled organisms down at the bottom of the tree of life here. But in time, we're going to get the evolution of multi-celled organisms. And in fact, multicellularity evolved many times independently in the animal branch and the plant branch, etc. And we're familiar with being multicellular. After all, we start off as a single fertilized egg, and then mitosis produces more and more cells that organize into our body. So here's an early embryo. The cells are sticking together. And so one idea of how multicellularity came about is that imagine a cell has some proteins on its membrane, and of course that protein has a recipe tucked away in the DNA somewhere. Well, imagine a mutation in the gene for that protein makes a protein that now is able to stick to itself. So when the cell undergoes mitosis, previously the two cells would have gone their separate ways, but now that protein can keep them together. And you have the origin of a sort of a multicellular individual. The fact that multicellularity evolved several times independently suggests there were definite advantages to being multicellular. Just consider, if you're living in a world where the predators are single cells, well, if you can be bigger than your predator, then you cannot be eaten by your predator. There are other advantages as well to being multicellular, but we'll just note here that, of course, animals are multicellular, fungi multicellular, and plants multicellular. So clearly, many life forms on Earth are multicellular, and it provided lots of advantages in the history of life on Earth.